Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Denise Russell Fleming, and I am one of the founding members of the Tech Pack and also VP and CIO of Boeing Defense, Space, and Security. It is my pleasure to join you today and to host our Tech Pack Fireside Chat with Dr. Vivian Ming. We are going to start our program off today with a quick video on Tech Pack, and then we will get started with the conversation.
If you share our vision,
take the pledge with us.
I pledge
to do all within my power
to create a world where anyone with a passion for technology
will have the opportunity to succeed.
I will hold myself accountable
to committing to being an example,
to advancing inclusion,
diversity, and equity
with my team, my partners, and my community.
Basically, a group of CIOs that have come together last summer in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And we all wanted to do our part to be able to make technology careers accessible for everyone. So that is the foundation of our organization. And the reason that we have brought this group together today to be able to be joined by, again, Dr. Vivian Ming. And she is a visionary in the space of AI and the co-founder and executive chair at Socos, which is a science incubator dedicated to solving some of the world's most pressing problems. In 2017, she was named as one of the BBC 100 women, and Inc. magazine named her as one of 10 women to watch in tech. She is the founder of 6 companies and frequently featured in her research in a variety of periodicals, including the New York Times, the Financial Times, and the Atlantic. She is an author, a mother, an inventor who also helped to build technology embedded in facial recognition that we each use every day on our cell phones. A truly fascinating woman with an incredible story that I encourage you all to hear her tell in her own words on a tech talk that she did that chronicles her metamorphosis from personal turmoil to triumph and evolution to commit her life to serving her purpose to make people's lives better. This is clearly illustrated in her AI research that has impact in a range of areas, from reuniting orphan children with extended family members, to predicting manic episodes, to creating ways to be able to help treat diabetes. Dr. Ming, it is my pleasure to welcome you today to Tech Pack and the Fireside Chat on culture versus AI and the research around attracting and retaining diverse talent. Welcome.
It is so wonderful to be here. The person you just described is so cool. I'd like to meet them someday. Or maybe terrifying. Absolutely. If they came up with the stuff that's reading your emotions on your phone. I'll tell you, when I worked on that as an undergrad 20 years ago, I had no idea, one, that lab would end up becoming the face recognition team for the iPhone, or two, that someday the things we were working on would actually, be achievable. It was all like science back then. There weren't you couldn't run this stuff on your phone. It was crazy. Wow, things changed.
Yeah, that's the beauty of technology. You start with a small idea and then the applications just blossom. So we appreciate you being here. And so I'll just start off with my first question. In layman's terms, just to set the foundation, how would you describe AI?
Yeah, I think the simplest way to describe it, which may come across a bit dry, but it carries a lot of information. It's any autonomous system that can make decisions under uncertainty. So let's unpack it a little bit. What does it mean? Let's just take some of the most famous cases recently. What move should I make in chess or Go? What should I bid on this hand of poker? How fast should this car be going as it takes a left turn on a dark, rainy night? I have a resume. Should this person be brought in for an interview? None of these have right answers, either because there truly is no right answer, or because it's just impossible to arrive at any sense of a ground truth. So all of them are decisions under uncertainty. And what's interesting is, realistically, up until quite recently, these were all pretty fundamentally human decisions. It's interesting that a number of other animals can make decisions under uncertainty, but that combination of higher level reasoning and being able to take imperfect information and arrive at a best answer rather than a right answer. Obviously, we could get into what modern artificial intelligence is, not just machine learning, but deep neural networks and the mathematics behind them. But, it's an evolving field anyways, which changes fairly quickly. So any specific algorithm, let me tell you, as someone who's published in that space, your main response from a reviewer is, it's been done before. What's new? You cured cancer, but did you do it in a new way? So it's a field that's hungry for new. But let's take it away. Here's an even more direct description of AI. Take any brief expert human judgment and now make it cheaper and faster, and in some cases approaching better than a human can make it. Again, every one of those examples I gave you, one I'm intimately familiar with and we may chat about would be looking at a resume. I don't know of anything remotely close to an AI that could select the perfect team. But what it can do is take the amount of time one recruiter or sourcer looks at a single resume, which is about 5 seconds, and it could look at 1 million resumes. And instead of taking 3 variables into account, your name, your school, and your last job, it could take 400,000 variables into account. So even if it isn't as good as a human being, you can pretty easily see the economics writ large there. And ultimately, the real question is, I think maybe for what we're going to talk about is, what is the net result of having a human make that judgment or having a machine make that judgment? And how does bias creep into that process? And on either side, frankly.
That's a great point. And, when you think about it, AI and ML have been used to solve, a variety of purposes and provide outcomes that are both positive and negative. And so regardless of the outcome, as you stated, it really can't fully solve our problems for us. So how much human oversight do you think is required to ensure that AI is leveraged ethically? And do you think that it diminishes the potential of the technology?
Yeah, I think what everyone in the audience here is going to discover very quickly is what I am not is someone that ever thinks the answer is yes or no. The answer is always messy and complicated. But this is one space where at least I can give a couple of straight responses. One is artificial intelligence is a tool. Its biggest positive boost, even if we just think in terms of productivity, is lifting creative human decision-making. AI can do routine tasks, again, cheaper and faster than a human can do it. And, even if it isn't better, one can imagine how a single person looking in a creative way at a complex problem, but maybe otherwise rate limited because they can only look at so many lines of data to make their, risk decision on an investment, or so many x-rays to decide whether that little blob looks like cancer or not. And here, by bringing the two together, that sort of amazingly hyperdimensional ability of humans to just glimpse a thing and come up with a useful insight, and the ability of machines to crunch massive amounts of data. So that's my dream space. But let's also be clear, there are a number of jobs that people shouldn't put themselves at risk to do low wage, highly routine, low wage power, low autonomy jobs. So if something truly is just a rote task, there's a degree to which it feels inevitable that we might try and automate those jobs away. Unfortunately, the brutal truth is all that really ends up doing is putting downward wage pressure on people. It'll be a long time, unfortunately, before machines are so inexpensive, particularly with physical, real-world tasks, that we'd have a robot doing something rather than just continually paying people less and less and less. So, those are the two things we're looking at. Automate all of these highly routine tasks, and complement, augment all of this creative labor. And we can choose any mix of those two things. But, my big belief here is if we really want to think about the long-term benefit to ourselves, we need to pull as many people over into that creative labor side as possible. And, I'll say this bluntly. If once you're done picking the tech stack you're going to work with and what kind of machine learning team you want to put together, the thing that is most going to return on your investment, the thing to put all of your money in to get the most out of AI, is to invest in your people.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I think, some of the research that you've done over the years, and, looking at tech workers and having the goal of driving bias out of the hiring process so that we can leverage that talent from every corner of every background. Many of our audience members are hiring managers. And so can you share with us from your research, what are some of the data points, whether tangible or intangible, that were indicators and predictors that you uncovered that could help us to drive bias out of the hiring process?
Yeah. So now let me start off by completely undermining my authority here, which is to say I've never had to interview for a job in my entire life. I'm a neuroscientist by training who started a couple of education companies with my wife. Like, what do I know about HR and hiring? But I actually got recruited out of one of my own companies to become the chief scientist of one of the very first companies using artificial intelligence in sourcing. And many of you listening may well have been a customer of ours back in the day. We ended up on the cover of the New York Times and the Atlantic. It was really heady stuff. And the whole idea is, in fact, our tagline, we bring meritocracy back to tech hiring. It is worth noting, by the way, in a completely separate set of research, that the more the concept of meritocracy is emphasized in assessing human capital, the worse the bias gets. How perverse that the very company that was trying to reduce bias in hiring actually might have made it worse by our very slogan. But we could get back to that if anyone wants to ask a question about it. So I was the chief scientist. We had a database of 122 million people. And my job was to figure out what made someone great at their job. It was super easy to figure out who get hired. That's something that's been studied for 100 years. And I already gave you a number, 5 seconds. You can quibble on the specifics there, but essentially, typical recruiter gives a resume, a LinkedIn profile, what have you, about 5 seconds. And they look at your job, your school, and your name. And if that doesn't fit a pattern, and we can imagine what name is a stand-in for, then that's it. There's not even a no. You're just not in consideration for a job. So in some sense, that's all we had to do better then, at least on the sourcing end. Because we could go out through 122 million working professionals. Our core was software developers, but we expanded to designers and salespeople and all these other professionals. High demand work, particularly in the tech industry. And we looked at 400,000 variables. And it turned out your name didn't predict anything. And when we took out the hidden information in that, gender, race, socioeconomic status, we again didn't find anything. You're never supposed to look at stuff like that in HR, but behind the scenes, I just wanted to take that off the table. And sure enough, so school and your university and your last job did predict something, but not once I knew other things about you. So what predicts it? Surely it's that you say you know Python on your resume, or that you went to Stanford. We found Stanford was, in fact, the top school for predicting skill for software developers. A Bachelor of Computer Science from Stanford was genuinely a positive, pretty modest one though. Ranked just above MIT, Caltech, then MIT, then CMU, then Cal. As a California kid, I was proud of the list, but I promised I didn't cheat. So that's really interesting, but it turns out we found another variable, both in the research literature, and then we replicated it in our data set, which was vastly more predictive than whether you went to Stanford as a software developer. Resilience. So we built cognitive models because that is repeatedly what people have found. Doesn't predict whether you get hired, predicts whether you're good at your job, who writes the best code, who has the highest sales volume. On the various sites where we would pull data from, and we pulled data from over 100 different sites, who had the highest rated design work. And you'd think totally different jobs. Surely they could have nothing in common. Were they resilient? Did they have good communication skills? Yes, shockingly enough, social skills were just as predictive for software developers as they were for salespeople. Rarer, I will fully acknowledge, they are considerably rarer in software developers, but when they were present, they were just as predictive of quality of work. Creativity, metacognition, general cognitive ability. So none of the things that are on a resume, very little of the things, essentially nothing we explicitly assess for during interviews. And I'm sure many of us are aware on the research, interviews are pretty good ways of figuring out who you'd like to hang out with after work, but not very good ways of assessing someone's ability long-term at a job. Some people seem to have this weird ephemeral ability to just nail it, meet someone and figure out, but it's a really rare quality. And it can be trained into people, but do you really want to take your best engineers and then just train them how to do intensive training on how to run interviews? So, this is what we found is essentially, I subsequently came up with a sort of umbrella term to capture all of this. We call it meta learning, your ability to learn how to learn. And what's interesting is I had another company doing education work at the same time. We found the exact same things were predictive of the long-term life outcomes of kids. The kid was high in working memory, they were resilient, they had a strong growth mindset, all of these sorts of things, many of which you've probably heard of before, some of which are a little bit more esoteric. We put together a list of about 50 of them. Not exhaustive, I'm sure, but we just wanted a catalog. And these things, if you wanted, absent the randomness that's a part of everyone's life, if you really wanted to get a sense of where someone was going. So we ran a test. We obscenely called it Predict the Rock Stars Before They're Famous. And we went into historical LinkedIn data and tried to predict the people that would become sort of superstar programmers 5 years before they reached that level. And our hit rate was astonishingly high. And whether you went to Stanford or not was not much of a factor. The majority, 10 to 100 times, depending on the field, 10 to 100 times, equally qualified people didn't have the pedigrees. So that's a huge population of people out there. And now I'm going to finish my little story here with a little heartbreak. So we built the system. I was so proud of it. This is 2013. We had explainable AI, which we can go into if you want, but we said why our algorithm thought this person, why your company should hire them. We pre-formatted a templated email so that with a personalized message, again, why this person should come to your company. And then we ran our user testing with this incredibly fancy artificial intelligence that no one had ever built before. People were paying us a lot of money to use it. And in 2/3 of our users, largely recruiters, they would open up a profile for about 5 seconds and they'd look at your name, your school, and your last job. They looked at the exact same people they would have looked at anyways, and they assessed them in exactly the same way they would have. Wow. Which is why AI does not magically solve problems. It's just a tool. And like so many other amazing tools in our world, it depends on how we use it. I think it would have been disastrous to have just automated, here's the top 3 people Guild's algorithm recommends, so just hire them. But turns out it was phenomenally difficult to get people to change the behavior that they themselves wanted to change.
Yeah. And in the end, it all comes down to people. And it's that fusion of the person and the technology, when you bring those two together, that really, help to make really impactful outcomes. So you talked about, doing some research around kids, and you've also done some research where you compared underrepresented kids who didn't go to college and those who may have gone to college. And your data had a few key differentiators on the outcomes for these two groups of students. Can you share a summary of that research that might help us as leaders and mentors to be able to multiply our impact?
And it's fascinating. It's fascinating because I'm going to start with a very specific story, and then suddenly it unfolds and it applies so broadly. So it was actually at Guild. We had this one guy, he and I actually ended up being the cover of that New York Times story, which upset the co-founders so much that they didn't end up on the cover. But I'm a bit colorful, I get it. And he hadn't gone to university, had never worked a traditional job before he worked at Guild. He was this very bright kid who'd done super well in high school, but no one in his family had ever gone to university. Let's be blunt. Let's tell the whole story. So he's sort of designing these T-shirts and selling them in LA. And he's getting a little traction, but he thinks, what I should do? I should start a website. So he does a little push button website to sell T-shirts, gets some traction, but he's frustrated. It's not good enough. So he teaches himself how to program, in this case, Ruby, and which is big, like half of the major websites in the world at the time were running on this. And he designs his own website, sells even more T-shirts, but now he doesn't care about T-shirts anymore. He's frustrated because Ruby isn't good enough. So he starts submitting pull requests to the core team behind this. Now, Ruby is an open source language, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the idea. It's just anyone can, in theory, contribute to its development. But the reality is, most of these languages are really controlled by a very small group of people. They want to make certain about quality control. So there's these nonprofit cohorts and a lot of corporate partnerships. But his pull requests from this random kid who'd never gone to university are being accepted. So he's submitting patches to fix aspects. There are websites all over the world that are running his code. So now he's thinking, why am I selling T-shirts in LA? I should be getting, a developer job up in Silicon Valley. So he starts sending resumes. For a whole year, he's sending resumes, and he doesn't get a single no. Then he certainly doesn't get a yes. And I already told you why. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have a previous job. He doesn't have a university, and his last name is Dominguez, which is not the name you're supposed to have if you want to get a job in tech, as an engineer at least. So no, he's getting no traction. And then this startup calls him out of the blue and says, hey, our algorithms tell us you're actually the second best Ruby developer in all of Los Angeles. Can we fly you up for an interview? So obviously that was us. And he became our lead front-end developer, eventually left to found his own company because he was awesome. In a funny sense, there's one sense in which we did something positive for him. But the reality is, he's an amazing kid, and he might have been able to bootstrap himself all the way there without our help. We did something positive for us. You imagine the fight for tech talent? We're recruiting against Google and Facebook at the time. It was brutal to get people onto my teams. And here was this kid that no one would they would run his code, but they wouldn't read his resume. So here's the funny thing. That's a bit of a lead in. That first year at the holidays, he goes home for a big chunk of December, and he comes back and he says, my dad saw how much I was making. It was like he'd never seen that much in a paycheck before. And I was hanging out with my friends in the neighborhood, and they all said, like, I was the first kid that ever met that actually got an engineering job or worked in Silicon Valley. And that like sparked something in me, because I just read this paper. This paper looked at kids who academically looked like their wealthy peers, but economically looked very different. So you might go either way. Your wealthy peers are all going off to university. You're straight A student, but your socioeconomic peers, almost none of them are going to university. So which way did these kids go? And it turns out, in surprisingly high numbers, even after they've been accepted, they don't take those acceptances. Maybe they'll go to the local state school instead of going to Harvard. Maybe they go to community college instead of the state school, and maybe they don't go at all, which is not just at a much higher rate than we see in, let's be blunt here, a straight, white, male American student. You just don't see that behavior among that other population. So for 100 years, just like with recruiting, people have been studying this. And armchair philosophers have been saying, Black kids, it's all culture. It's just culturally different from white kids. There's nothing we can do about it. Oh, Hispanic kids, it's economics. They got to support their family and stay at home. Finally, in this paper that came out right during this moment, someone did something which just seems so rational. Some of these kids take the scholarships and they go, and some of them don't. What's different between them? Instead of comparing them to someone who's different in any number of ways, what is uniquely different between these two populations? And it turns out there was essentially one single thing. There was nothing culturally different. There was nothing economically different. The only real substantial difference, someone from their neighborhood had gone before them. They had tangible evidence that their hard work was going to pay off. And I will keep this follow-up kind of short, but that really inspired me. And I will freely admit, when I was reading this paper, it said like low SCS high performing students. But in my head, I read Black student or Hispanic student. And then I realized this is my dad. My dad grew up a sharecropper in Kansas, which sounds like fiction to me. I mean, impossible. I knew a doctor in California. He was a dirt farmer in nowhere. And he graduated the top of his entire class for the whole state of Kansas and had full scholarships literally everywhere. And didn't go, went to the local state school. Now, University of Kansas is a perfectly fine school. He tutored Wilt Chamberlain in chemistry. But he always felt like he'd never lived up to his potential because bluntly in the moment, for my grandparents, what was the point? Why go halfway across the country to some technical school, MIT, on a full 5-year scholarship when you're just going to end up back on the farm? So he didn't bother. And, to think that this hits everywhere. And I'll finish with this. So I got really curious and I built a bunch of AIs, little web crawlers that crawled across the websites of 60,000 companies, surely most of the people represented here, and looked for evidence of factors that drive gender wage gap. Sounds like I'm telling a totally different story here. But so why are women paid less than men? Economists have a pretty pat story for this. Whether you're liberal or conservative, women make different work choices than men. And therefore it ends up meaning you get paid less. I thought that's not good enough. Why are they making different choices? Obviously, I had my suspicions given all of this research. So I'll just go to the punchline. Single biggest predictor of variation in wage gap. Because if it was just women's choices, it'd be the same in every single company. And it most certainly is not. Single biggest predictor of variation in wage gap, the number of female faces on the leadership team. More women on the board, more women in C-suite, particularly roles like CEO, CFO. I didn't even look at CTO, but I'm willing to bet. Suddenly, younger women choose to invest more hours in their career and wage gap drops. So yes, women were making choices, but just like those kids from the neighborhood or from the farm, what those choices reflected was whether they believed their hard work would pay off. I'm going to work hard no matter what, but maybe I'm going to put it in my church or my family or my relationships or something else. If I know the guy working next to me can work half as hard and go twice as far, then why is it rational for me to put in the same effort? When you see the evidence, then you invest the effort.
Thank you for sharing that, particularly that story about Gil. That's very inspiring, just kind of hearing his path. There's so much packed in there. I mean, both from, the perspective that he was a non-traditional kind of career path of what people would look for, and then finding that hidden talent. I think there's so much power in AI to be able to help us to do things like that. And, to the point we made earlier about people and how they think, and leverage that technology.
It gets at that core issue, which is we really could build a system, not a giant deep neural network thrown blindly at a huge mass of data. We studied the science. We found things that we knew were predictive, like resilience, like communication skills or perspective taking. We built targeted systems to look for those qualities. We tested whether they had bias on gender or race before we released them. And then we put this out there with explainability built into it. I'm genuinely proud of what we built, but it also shows you building fancy technology is not the same thing as solving a problem, because the problem was the whole one of the behavior of the recruiters and the hiring managers themselves. We needed to make a change there at the same time. It's just a tool.
Yeah. And one other nugget you had in there, I want to make sure I reemphasize is, something that I truly believe in, and that is that you can be what you can see, and the power of representation. So thank you for, bringing that home with some of your stories. The last question that I'll ask, and then we'll open things up to our audience, is there's a Bill of Rights to govern facial recognition and other potentially harmful uses of artificial intelligence that the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy is launching a fact-finding mission around that. That started a few weeks ago. And so just curious, around your thoughts of, does an AI Bill of Rights, help us to be able to ensure that the power of technology, stays in alignment with the rights of the people?
Yeah, I launched off here by saying that there are only ever messy human problems. They're only ever going to have messy human answers. I love the fact that we're finally taking these issues seriously. As someone who got their start, literally my introduction to the world of machine learning was finding your philtrum, if you didn't know the name of this little thing here, and your pupils, and figuring out whether you were smiling. It was so cool. I mean, I thought I was going to stick wires into cat brains for the rest of my career. And suddenly I got introduced to this idea that you could build artificial brains on a computer and actually teach it how to do things. And in the year since, I see the evidence of the positive things that can be done with that specific technology, not just AI generally, but even facial analysis, and the terrible things that can be done with it. They are both true. I got to build, actually, for this particular technology, Google gave me a pair of Google Glass, asked me to come up with ideas of things to do with it. And I had a few that I enjoyed, but one that really resonates with my personal life is I built a system that analyzes people's faces and then writes the expression up in the little heads up display. Now, you could do all sorts of bad things with this. Let me tell you, the project in my undergraduate lab was funded by the CIA. You can imagine what they wanted to do with this stuff. But what I was doing was trying to build a system to teach autistic children how to read facial expressions. They can learn how, but it's like a second language. It takes effort, takes exposure. I thought, what if they could do it while they're actually interacting with people rather than cartoon faces on flashcards? Not only does it work better than the cartoon faces, but it turned out those kids also increased their theory of mind, their empathy. I think the story is, if there's a story behind why someone's smiling, then they start to make sense. But if happy is just a cartoon face on a flashcard, then you just are happy and there's no theory of mind behind it. Another case you mentioned in my intro, I won't belabor the point, but we built a system to reunite orphan refugees with their extended family members. And boy, there's very little I can imagine worse in the world than being an orphan in a refugee camp. They are really nightmarish experiences again and again and again. And we built a system which, again, it has a whole story behind it, but essentially you had a little tablet and you selected faces that look more like your niece. And if she's in a camp anywhere in the world, in about 3 to 5 minutes, you found her. That was facial recognition technology. Facial recognition technology, of course, is also being used in ways that I find truly terrifying, and in ways that are absurd. There's a company called HireVue that claims that they can analyze your face during interviews and decide whether you should get hired or not. As someone who is an expert in both what predicts hiring and facial analysis, no, there is no such science there. We could have a deep, complex discussion about it, but on its surface, they're not making an honest claim. And that is deeply problematic, that you can build a thing, turn it loose in the world, or this other company that's just collecting masses and masses of faces from public data and building a giant service and selling it to police departments and other groups. I do see that this is a complex question, because you can do good. And if we simply say no, people will be harmed. If we simply say yes, people will be harmed. So is a Bill of Rights the right approach? I'm always a little wary about legislating technology. Imagine like a single law that says you can't, invent a certain kind of drug, or you can't do a certain kind of business. Not only will the business world just figure out how to flow around that now static tentpole, it's governance that laws should be giving, rather than a fixed infrastructure. So there's some things I'm more supportive of, and I'll go through them super quickly. One is the financial world wouldn't work without audits. They're imperfect, but they're real. I think we should all step up and start saying, just the way I wouldn't trust a public company that isn't doing financial audits, I won't trust a public company that isn't doing data audits. And algorithm too, not just data. And I mean, you got to open the books. Let people see that not only does the algorithm do what the math says, but the outcomes do what the product says. Another is, I know we're talking about some organizations that have some really tarnished brands right now, but building things like a CDC or WHO for abuses of data and technology is something we could all think about. But here's something I really believe in, and I'll finish my answer here. There's something called a data trust, which is a trust, a nonprofit entity that collectivizes data amongst individual people. So you say, you know what, I like the idea that my data might be used for health, but I don't like that it might be used for ad targeting. So I'm going to join this data trust of people that are like-minded, and that collectivized data then actually mediates my relationships with Facebook and Google and the IRS and everyone else. It's an idea that's been around for a little while. And to me, one of the big problems in AI is there's a wild imbalance in power. A very small number of companies control it all. So what interest do they have in, really solving some of these big, complicated problems if there isn't that much of a competition for them to worry about?
Right.
we need to balance out that power structure. And here's what I'll throw down. I believe in it so much that I've just started a new company working in the public health space. And we are funding a data trust that will own all of the data that we generate. So we won't own our own data. Our users will, literally, legally. And we will only ever be able to use it for their permission. Our value proposition is what it is. I'm not here to sell it, but we believe in it so much that I don't even want a board or shareholders to ever be tempted to go fish for value in selling that data. So that's how much I believe in it. I literally put my money where my mouth is.
That's great. Well, Vivian, I really appreciate you sharing your stories with us. You've helped us to be able to see the power of AI and everything from healthcare to hiring and many facets of diversity. But I want to give our audience an opportunity to be able to ask some questions. And looks like we have one coming in now, if I can get to the chat. So there's interesting questions about human oversight and laws protecting limits to biometric or face data. What I believe I learned was that AI processes job candidate selection autonomously and produces socially and technically better results. However, the valuable results are muted by human intervention of recruiters. I say that we need to build the character of our world citizens to lead by example of their leadership, ethics, and responsibility to moderate the technology. And to do that, we need standards, laws, and leadership versus a mandate. So thank you for sharing your perspective around that.
I'll comment on that
Sure.
and say that it's certainly, I agree, and I think you caught the flavor of a lot of my thinking about this. A lot of people think, for example, we should have ethics training for engineers. Like, that's the problem, is somehow these unemotional, unthinking engineers are making mistakes. I have to say, some of my grad students have been some of the most thoughtful and open-minded people I've ever had the pleasure to work with. I received ethics training as a neuroscientist. There's ethics classes in business school. Turns out people still do bad things, even in a world of ethics training. For me, one of the core problems is the algorithms can provide a value, but somewhat famously, Amazon, for example, had a big misstep, and I'm intimately familiar with it because they recruited me to be their chief scientist for people to do this very project, to build a giant deep neural network, look at all of their hiring history data, and decide who to hire going forward. And somewhat famously, there's a great whole story here, but I'll just go to it. Somewhat famously, this deep neural network that they developed would not hire women. It was just irredeemably sexist. If you just had the word women's on your resume, it automatically downrated it. Why? Because the historical data at Amazon looks bluntly like the historical data at almost every other tech company. Your most likely promotion in your first year comes if you're male versus female. It's just the biggest, easiest correlation for a machine learning system to find. And that's what they are. They are massively complicated correlation engine. They can understand causality if we build them that way, but we almost never do. So they did what seems like the standard practice. They scrubbed out all of the gender markers, all of the names, all the women's schools, women's colleges, and the AI did something amazing. It figured out who was a woman and wouldn't hire them. Now, Amazon had the good graces of never putting the thing into production. They just, drug it around the back of the barn and got rid of it. But it still points to what I think is, in fact, a bit of a deeper problem. One is, which I've alluded to before, these problems are bigger than a single technology. In this case, you had a bunch of very, very smart, young, largely but not exclusively men, being brought in and being told, we have the perfect data set, all of our history, we have the perfect question, did you get a promotion in your first year? And we have all the answers, which is exactly what we train machine learning students to do in graduate school. Here's ImageNet. We're going to predict dog breeds in these pictures, and here's all the right answers. So they did exactly what they were trained how to do. In over 20 years, I have never once, forget the perfect data set, I've never even been given the right question to ask. That's the starting point. What is the question we truly want an answer to? And it turns out it is not who got a promotion in the past, for obvious reasons. Who got a home loan in the past? So what we need is to invest deeply in people as problem solvers, not as rote machines, because quite bluntly, a lot of data science is itself getting automated away. And what's left is your ability to truly creatively explore the unknown and have this incredibly powerful tool to help you. So again, never slip into the mistaken impression that AI will solve a problem. It cannot solve a problem we do not already have a solution to, but it can fundamentally change the economics of those solutions. And yes, when you play it at advanced level, it is a powerful tool for creative people to explore and come up with those solutions. But that becomes the messy story here. It's us. We're the ones that need the upgrade in a sense, in a lot of different dimensions, more so than the machines.
Great, thank you. So the next question we have from the audience is, have you considered building AI tools to help tech training organizations identify and recruit candidates from underrepresented communities and underserved neighborhoods?
Yeah, so I have done a variety of projects in this space, and one of them is interesting and illustrative. So back during the Obama White House, they ran these things called data jams and data paloozas. So if we ignore the terrible naming, they'd bring in crazy weirdos like me, and you'd hang out the White House for a day or two with the data jam, and some department, labor or health or education, would be a co-sponsor of that day's event. So I got to come to a bunch of these. And we did this one with, I think, Department of Commerce, OSTP, and Labor. And we came together and we were looking specifically at HR. And I thought, my God, we have the best data set, HR data set ever. The entire hiring history of the US federal government. It's the biggest, the Office of, oh my goodness, I've lost
Personnel
the name.
Management?
There you go, OPM. Like they have this salt mine in Pennsylvania that has literally the entire HR history of the United States inside of it. Not all of it's digitized, and so much federal data is like, yes, we're in compliance with data, openness laws, because if you go halfway down this page, there's a drop menu that has badly copied PDFs on it. So that's the kind of data you often had to work with at the time. But we have this huge history of data. So I thought, what if we could make a magical pair of glasses that showed you your own bias when you looked at someone's resume? So how do we do this? First off, let's just accept the fact that there's a bunch of systemic bias that would be really hard to deal with. So we're just going to look at your unique bias relative to the other recruiters, rather than what might be a baseline. So we took all of this history and we looked at the features when you, as an active recruiter with OPM, hired someone. What made you uniquely more likely to hire them that did or didn't have anything to do with their actual success on the job later? Now, the actual success on the job later is where a lot of the systemic bias might be represented, and I just didn't have ground truth to fix that. But at least I could look at how an individual recruiter responded to this data. So we did this, we built all this stuff up, and then we color coded the resumes. So if you overvalued something, number one overvalued detail, an Ivy League degree. I'm not saying that it isn't predictive of someone being good at their job, but virtually every recruiter at OPM substantially overvalued. Essentially, they treated an Ivy League degree as much more predictive of success on the job than it actually was. Number one undervalued quality, a female name. It was substantially decreased the likelihood that someone would be brought in, and yet showed no actual relationship or much less of a relationship than their actual job performance ever indicated. So we'd see all of these things. And the whole idea is then you could turn it on or off, but when you turned it on, you'd pull up a new resume and it would be color coded with your own historical bias in mind. And you could see the throwaway things, works good with teams, that you tell yourself doesn't bias your hiring, but it turns out it actually does. People are more likely to hire given that kind of language, and it doesn't predict anything. So we did all this stuff. It was really cool. And we found some curious cases. Like there was this one job where the women all had PhDs. Every woman ever hired under this job code had a PhD. Didn't know what the job was. All we had were these abstract codes. But the men, about even numbers of PhD, masters, bachelors, about 30, 30 each. So clearly it's something that required some expertise, but that's a pretty wild, if 2/3 of the men didn't have PhDs to get the job and all of the women did, what's going on? So we actually went to our OPM sort of rep on this and we asked them about it. And they said, like straight up, oh no, we hire all sorts of women for this job without PhDs. And we're like, we have all of your historical data. You've never hired a woman without a PhD for this job. And they didn't believe it. From their own data, they didn't believe it, which is a truth in a lot of my work. No one is the villain in their own life story. No one thinks they're the one that's doing this. I genuinely believe these people were surprised to see what was going on, but clearly the bias was there. So now for the heartbreak, it never got put in place. I mean, there's a variety of reasons things don't happen, but one very explicit reason is it's an open acknowledgement of bias, which leaves them open to legal repercussions. So the irony is a tool we built to reduce bias in hiring got flushed because it identified bias in hiring. That kind of hurts. A lot of the work we do at Socos Labs, we're just a philanthropic, mad science lab, as I say. People bring us problems just like this one. And if I think my team and I can make a meaningful difference, then I pay for everything and we just try to come up with solutions. And if we do, we give it away. Just the worst business idea ever. And so sometimes all you can do is say, this is possible. It is possible to build an AI for diabetes. It is possible to surface bias on a recruiter as a point of training rather than a point of punishment. But there are various things which, a little lab can actually bring fully into the world and things we can only do a proof of concept of. And both of those fell into that domain.
Well, I'm very glad that you have chosen the business model that you have that allows a lot of these solutions to be solved for different organizations to be able to take advantage of. And, I think it would be very informative to have information about, what our personal biases are. So I'm glad to know it exists, and maybe at some point we'll figure out the right fusion between the legal and the technology and people to be able to make it come to life. But Vivian, I want to thank you for being with us today, and just want to give our audience an opportunity to know how they can continue to follow and learn more about your research if they're interested.
If I have not sufficiently scared you away enough already, then you are welcome to make the foolish decision and put socos.org, into your browser, and you can visit our site. You can sign up for our newsletter where I essentially share these kinds of stories of my work and explore new work that we're doing in real time. It turns out I find one of the best ways to convey science into the world isn't through a technical paper, but it's through the actual story of how hard it is to make this stuff work in the real world. And I do occasionally find myself nowadays finally visiting places again. It's been a long time, but I had the chance to travel around, and it's always a pleasure to come in I'm not a consultant, but I spend a lot of time doing what we call briefings, where I just come in and people tell me about what's hard, and I have the chance to give them advice and tell some stories. It's wonderful to think that the things we build don't end with those things, but that there's an opportunity for other people to learn as well. So visit socos.org and learn more about what we do, and keep your ear open for some strange new public health company that might be entering into the conversations of the world. I also have a bunch of neurotechnologies company for anyone that wants to truly geek out about cyborgs. So you should be very concerned about a neuroscientist who says that it's the humans that need the upgrade. So I get to do a whole lot of things, but start at our website.
Great. Dr. Vivian Ming, we thank you for spending time with us today on behalf of my colleagues at the Tech Pack. We thank you for sharing your insights with us, educating us a bit more on the power of AI and how it can be leveraged to drive diversity and inclusion. So thank you very much, and I wish everyone a great rest of your day.